Okay. All right. Well, if it's okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. First of all, thank you for everybody for joining us on this lovely October afternoon. I guess it is. I am far away in Scotland, so it's late at night for me, but probably much warmer where you guys are. Anyway, or wherever you're joining us from. I guess in the age of Zoom, you never know. My name is Matthew Gabriel. I'm the chair. I'm a professor of medieval studies and chair of the Department of Religion and Culture. And this lecture by Dr. Wise, who I'll introduce in just a moment, is part of an annual series, a new series that we began just last year as part of our affiliated research faculty program, in which the department offers a competitive research faculty appointment within the department for underemployed faculty across the country, and sometimes elsewhere as well, to give them library access, mentorship, and other sorts of support as much as we are able to do so. And so we have another talk coming up in November. And then we'll have two in the spring as well. So if you're interested in those, please just look me up and send me an email, and we'll be happy to add you to our mailing list. But for right now, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Daniel S. Wise. Dr. Wise took his PhD from the University of Virginia and wrote his recent dissertation on ways in which the 21st century American ghost hunting serves as a model for understanding enchantment in late modernity. His research focuses on paranormal belief and other aspects of the shifting contemporary American religious landscape. And as such, his talk today is entitled Haunted Modernity, just in time for Halloween. That's not part of the title, sorry. Haunted Modernity, Encounters with Spirits of the Dead as Empirical. And I will turn it over to him, and I will disappear from your screen. Please, Dr. Wise.
All right, thank you everyone for being here. And I just want to thank Virginia Tech for this program. I have a day job, but I continue my research. I'm an independent scholar, and it is so like one of the things you miss the most is library access, right? It is so hard to do research without access to a university library, especially digitally. So thank you for that. And yeah, I requested to give my talk near Halloween. It's all about ghosts. So basically, I'll say a couple things first. So I basically refer to the period we are in now as late modernity. There's some debate about this, but I am convinced, along with a few other scholars, that we're basically in many ways a continuation of modernity. This talk basically looks at sort of the ways in which ghosts have been seen as, or ghost encounters have been seen as empirical evidence against materialism across the modern period. So my dissertation was on basically 21st century American ghost hunters, and you'll hear more about that later. And I basically, I guess in doing some reading and thinking, noticed some connections, but in the ways in which I guess I noticed some connections in how in the modern period, ghosts have been sort of an important way to resist materialism basically throughout the period. So yeah, so these are just some observations. I go way back into way back earlier into modernity than I'm used to going, but I thought I'd give it a chance, and this talk has really given me a chance to think about that. So all right, here we go. Throughout modernity, people in the English-speaking West have periodically turned to encounters with the spirits of the dead as a way to combat the creeping philosophical materialism that characterizes the modern era. For these people, spirit encounters seem to have the advantage of being empirical, unlike many aspects of traditional religious belief, which were seen to be based on the testimony of tradition and ancient scripture. The tradition of appealing to empirical spirit encounters has led to widespread interest in spirits in the 21st century, perhaps most evidenced in the ghost hunting subculture. For ghost hunters, the empirical nature of spirit encounters takes on a second valence. It is important for post-Christian spirituality that the metaphysical can be experienced. So basically, that's a second aspect of it. So I'm mainly going to be talking about empirical as things that can be observed with the senses, proof that is gathered by the senses. But at the end, I'll talk about a different valence in which modern ghost hunting is empirical or experience-based. All right, so one of the thinkers who most shaped modernity was Francis Bacon, the English philosopher and statesman. Of course, he's a key figure in the development of empiricism in the English-speaking world. He is best known for being the father of the modern scientific method. That's his legacy, at least. The idea that science should be performed through precise empirical observation and inductive reasoning, more or less. Among those he directly influenced was English philosopher Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes shook the English-speaking intellectual world when he published his work Leviathan in 1651. Now, Leviathan was, I think, largely a political work, but in it, Hobbes proposed an account of human nature and action that was utterly materialist, meaning it denied the influence of or existence of an immaterial soul. So basically, he explained human interaction based solely in physical terms, right? Physical forces. The spirit was the human soul was not necessary to explain human action. Even though Hobbes himself did not deny the existence of a creator God, many saw his denial of spirits as a slippery slope. As English philosopher and Anglican clergyman Joseph Glanville wrote, quote, "Those that dare not bluntly say there is no God content themselves, for a fair step in introduction, to deny there are spirits or witches," end quote. Thus, spirit encounters were considered by some to be center stage in the battle against materialism. Several Englishmen of the 17th century wrote collections of ghost and witchcraft accounts to try to combat materialist claims. Bacon's empiricism had directly paved the way for Hobbes' materialism, and Bacon's thought was influential among intellectuals of the time, especially among those who, like Hobbes, denied the reality of things like ghosts and witchcraft. And of course, Hobbes had besides just implying that ghosts don't exist, he had actually argued against the reality of ghost experiences. As a result, though apologists of the time did use philosophical reason and scripture to argue for the existence of spirits, the presentation of reliable accounts of spirit encounters seems to have been valued as something perhaps empiricist skeptics would accept. One such compilation was Joseph Glanville's, who was quoted earlier. It was called Saggissimus Triumphatus, or Full and Plain Evidence Concerning Witches and Apparitions in Two Parts. And those of you who study antiquity, or I guess, anyone who's studying Christian history might, be able to glean why Saggissimus Triumphatus is the name of this text. In this volume, Glanville lays out proofs from philosophy and from scripture for the existence of spirits, but for those skeptics who will not accept such proofs, he ends his work with a list of plausibly authentic spirit encounters from what he sees as reliable people. This seems to be as close as Glanville can easily get to empirical evidence of spirits. Not legends, not obscure tales, not ancient and unverifiable accounts, but vetted accounts of respectable people's empirical observations of ghostly phenomena. So to give you an example of how Glanville sees these tales, after one of the first ghost encounters he describes, he basically writes out a little commentary on why this should be good evidence. Quote, "I have thus related the sum of the story and noted some circumstances that assure the truth of it. I confess the passages recited are not so dreadful, tragical, and amazing as there are some in stories of this kind, yet are they nevertheless probable or true for their being not so prodigious and astonishing. And they are strange enough to prove themselves effects of some invisible extraordinary agent, and so demonstrate that there are spirits who sometimes sensibly intermeddle in our affairs. And I think they do it with clearness of evidence. For these things were not done long ago, or at a far distance, in an ignorant age, or among a barbarous people. They were not seen by 2 or 3 only of the melancholic and superstitious, and reported by those that made them serve the advantage and interest of a party. They were not the passages of a day or night, nor the vanishing glances of an apparition, but these transactions were near and late, public and frequent, and of diverse years' continuance, witnessed by multitudes of competent and unbiased attesters, and acted in a searching and incredulous age. Arguments enough, one would think, to convince any modest and capable reason." So now we're going to take the biggest jump in history, all the way to the mid-19th century. And in the mid-19th century, we have one of modernity's most famous explosions of contact with spirits of the dead. In 1849, in Hydesville, a little town in upstate New York, friends and neighbors began gathering in the home of the Fox sisters, young women who seemed to elicit ghostly communication from the spirits of a dead peddler supposedly buried in the basement of their home. The spirit would communicate through mysterious knocking sounds, or they were called raps at the time. Eventually, other spirits began to make themselves known, spirits of the dead loved ones of those gathered. The oldest Fox sister developed the gift of trance mediumship, wherein she would communicate with spirits while in a trance state, making more detailed communication possible than what was enabled by the knocking sounds. Here is where the basics of 19th century seance spiritualism were established, and the phenomenon quickly spread across the United States, across the Atlantic to Britain, and across Europe. Historian Anne Browdy, who has written one of the definitive accounts of the spiritualist movement, defines spiritualism as, quote, a new religious movement aimed at proving the immortality of the soul by establishing communication with the spirits of the dead, end quote. So the whole point of this movement was that they found the need to prove the immortality of the soul through direct spirit contact, empirical spirit contact. Spiritualists' main form of spirit communication was the seance, which involved a group gathering around a table in usually a dimly lit room. There would generally be at least one spirit medium present in the circle around the table, often a woman, and she would generally enter a trance state and either relay what the spirits were saying or doing, or even let spirits take control of her body and speak for themselves. And there were other methods of spirit communication, automatic writing, where spirits would control what the medium was writing. The planchette was invented during this time, which is, the predecessor to the Ouija board. Anyway, sometimes there were physical manifestations of spirit activity, especially later in the 19th century. The table would move, mysterious objects would float through the air, ectoplasm, a mysterious whitish substance would flow out of a medium's bodily orifices and form shapes. This became particularly popular in the later 19th century. So there are many religious and cultural factors that led to the appeal and rise of spiritualism. But the ones important for us are those that especially gained strength in the latter decades of the 19th century. Basically, as the 19th century progressed, there was more and more need for specifically empirical evidence of the spirit world and an afterlife. So for one, the forces of materialism in the English-speaking world that were kindled in the time of Hobbes would continue to grow. And into the second half of the 19th century, Darwin's theory of evolution through natural selection would spread through the popular consciousness. This period also saw rising popular awareness of higher criticism of the Bible, which is a type of biblical scholarship that treats the biblical text as historical documents produced by human forces. Right? There's no, just simply this was inspired by the Holy Spirit. These scholars wanted to discuss the ways in which social forces and human interaction and historical forces shape the Bible as any other human historical document. And these two things sort of raised some doubts among some about the, steadfastness of traditional witnesses to the spirit world. All of this coincided with a rise in the prestige of science in the English-speaking world. Technology such as the telegraph arose, which often seemed as mysterious as spirit communication. And often spiritualism was called the spiritual telegraph, which is kind of interesting. So the spiritualists, rather than relying on tradition or religious authority, they wanted what they saw as better evidence for dearly held beliefs about spirits and the afterlife. Spiritualists often prided themselves on being a rational religion and for basing their beliefs on what they observed with their own senses, right? So they saw the mediums overtaken. They heard things that only their dead relatives could have known. They saw the things floating through the air. They felt the table tipping. With their own eyes, they saw evidence of the spirit world. They didn't read it in an ancient text. It wasn't told to them. They saw it with their own eyes. It was empirical. And one quote that I think really emphasizes this is one Browdy uses in her book. In 1869, renowned English spiritualist speaker and writer Emma Hardinge described spiritualism as a religion that, quote, that is, quote, separate in all respects from any existing sect, because it bases its affirmations purely upon the demonstrations of fact, science, and natural law, end quote. All right, so whether or not spiritualist phenomena were indeed based on scientific demonstration would eventually be taken up by a devoted group of generally more skeptical intellectual elites. The central organization in this endeavor was the Society for Psychical Research, founded in London in 1882. Its membership consisted of educated men and women from diverse fields and occupations, and its goal was to scientifically investigate spiritualist phenomena. Though many of the new academic psychologists of the time, psychology as a scientific field was just forming at this period. So the those who saw themselves as more scientifically respectable in the forming field of psychology, as well as other elements of the scientific community, did oppose the Society for Psychical Research. But on the other hand, it was generally not academically or politically embarrassing to be part of the organization. So, for example, early members of the society included Arthur Balfour, a future prime minister, authors Alfred Tennyson, William Ruskin, and Charles Dodgson, also known as Lewis Carroll, 2 bishops, and 8 fellows of the Royal Society. One of the society's leaders and most famous American members was William James, a Harvard professor who is sometimes called the father of American psychology, and he's the author of a classic text in the academic field of religious studies, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And you could say for decades, William James's activity with psychical research was kind of pushed aside by, scholars who wanted to take him seriously and not be embarrassed. But recently, his psychical research has been seen by some scholars as being more and more central to his life in general. When the society was founded, it was joined by many spiritualists, eager for the society to give the movement scientific legitimacy. However, over time, the society gained a reputation for being hard-headed and overly skeptical when it came to accepting claims of spirit phenomena. So in 1886, this conflict came to a boil when society researcher Nora Sidgwick published a report arguing that the popular medium William Eglinton was a fraud. There was a large exodus of spiritualists from the society. The society basically found itself in a position in which scientific materialists claimed they were hopelessly credulous, and spiritualists claimed they were unreasonable materialists. As rigorous and skeptical as the society's researchers could sometimes be, many of them seemed to have been engaged in psychical research because they held out hope for definitive empirical evidence contrary to materialism. Historian of psychical research Alan Gauld has argued that the driving force behind the society was a group of young, educated, quote-unquote, reluctant agnostics. This group, who were the society's most active workers, quote, all had come from religious and even deeply religious households. All had been driven some distance away from the faiths in which they had been reared, end quote. According to historian R. Lawrence Moore, the group, quote, worried constantly, as they readily admitted, about what they regarded as the excessively materialistic biases of 19th century science, end quote. What these reluctant agnostics ultimately feared was the cold, utterly meaningless world that they believed materialism entailed. They believed belief in materialism would drive the world into amorality and despair. The necessity such people felt to save the soul of Western civilization is made clear in an exchange of letters between the philosopher Thomas Davidson and William James in 1883 and 1884. So this is right after the founding of the society. Davidson urged that only, quote, complete social regeneration, end quote, could save Europe, and this could only be achieved by, quote, a scientific insight into the eternity of the individual, such as no philosophy now in vogue is able to give, end quote. James replies in agreement, arguing that for a new popular religion to replace, quote, the ruins of old Christianity, end quote, there would have to be cultivated, quote, belief in new physical facts and possibilities, end quote. James continued, abstract considerations about the soul and the reality of a moral order will not do in a year what the glimpse into a world of new phenomenal possibilities would do in an instant. Are the much despised spiritualism and the Society for Psychical Research to be the chosen instruments for a new era of faith? It would surely be strange if they were, but if they are not, I see no other agency that could do the work. Overall, the leaders and researchers of the society strongly believe in the supremacy of scientific empiricism as a way of discerning reality. They were hoping to use the empirical tools that had tightened the noose of materialism to find a way out. Frederick W.H. Myers, who was a poet and a professor of classics at Cambridge, who was a prominent founder of the society, put it this way, quote, what is needed is simply a dispassionate intellectual curiosity bent upon unraveling the indication of man's survival after earthly manhood with the same candid diligence which has so lately unraveled the indications of man's descent from the brute, end quote. Furthermore, mankind must maintain, quote, the same dispassionate curiosity and steady persistence of research by which alone objective truth in any direction has ever been obtained by man, end quote. All right, so spiritualism never completely disappeared. But in the early decades of the 20th century, its widespread popularity declined from its cultural height. In part because of the public unveiling of widespread fraud among mediums, especially those mediums who produce the most dramatic and theatrically visible spirit manifestations. Now, to be clear, I don't think there's evidence that even the vast majority of these mediums were frauds, as in like they were explicitly and consciously faking, but obviously some of them were, for theatrical reasons. Most psychical researchers, like those from the Society for Psychical Research, gradually began to see psychical phenomena as evidence for the extraordinary powers of the human mind, rather than evidence of the activity of spirits of the dead. So, for example, the unexplained knowledge of mediums, things such as apparitions and things like objects seemingly moved by unseen forces, could be more readily explained by the powers of mind to communicate information from afar and affect physical objects in supernormal ways than by spirits of the dead. In their mind, the idea that minds communicated from afar was, a simpler and more logical explanation for these strange things than, spirits of the dead persisted. They thought you had to take a lot more steps to get to that second idea. A decisive shift to laboratory psychical research, which would come to be called parapsychology, occurred in the 1930s and 40s, when husband and wife team J.B. Rhine and Louisa E. Rhine, both botanists with the University of Chicago PhDs, founded a research laboratory at Duke University with Harvard psychology professor William McDougall. Now, the Rhine Research Institute, I think, is still there, but it moved across the street and it's not officially affiliated with Duke anymore. And I had to add this little aside here. One of the largest remaining academic institutions pursuing parapsychology is the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia School of Medicine. The division was founded by the first chair of UVA's psychiatry department in 1967 and was originally funded by an endowment from Chester Carlson, the inventor of Xerox technology. It currently employs psychiatrists, neuroscientists, and at least one electrical engineer studying things like children who remember past lives, near-death experiences, altered states of consciousness, and other things. Members of the division have published multiple books in recent decades with massive amounts of documentation of experiments and observations presented as evidence for the theory that mind is not reducible to physical processes in the brain, and that, to the contrary, the brain is simply a filter or receiver of mind and ultimately non-physical phenomenon. So anyway, moving on. At its height around the turn of the 20th century, the Society for Psychical Research did investigate reportedly haunted houses from time to time, not just, mediums. This activity declined with the shift toward interest in the supernormal powers of mind rather than spirits of the dead. Most academically trained parapsychologists since the Rhines have stuck to laboratory research as a result of an obsession with collecting. Many parapsychologists in the second half of the 20th century have been obsessed with creating more and more rigorously controlled and exacting experiments, hoping that the perfection of their experiments in the lab will finally sway the scientific community, the mainstream scientific community, into accepting the reality of psychical phenomena. This means that most people who have investigated hauntings throughout the 20th century out in the field have varied widely in methodology, rigor, and credibility in the eyes of both elite parapsychologists in the lab and mainstream scientists. So, you just have a wide range of people still doing seances, people using all kinds of technical equipment. And on that point, so basically, during the days of the Society for Psychical Research, and even into the 1920s, haunting investigations generally involved in-person observation and investigation of the alleged haunted location, as well as careful collection of witness testimony and questioning of witnesses. Advances in technology changed how ghost hunters investigated as the 20th century progressed. So in the second half of the 20th century, scattered paranormal field investigators in the US and the UK accumulated new techniques and new gadgets to aid in their investigations. And of course, these investigators with their sort of electronic and technical gadgets inspired the 1984 film Ghostbusters. However, the actual investigators generally did not have, such spectacular equipment, that shot energy beams and trapped ghosts. Instead, they would use equipment designed for other purposes, such as Geiger counters and Gauss meters, to detect spirit activity. At least they theorized that this is what was happening. All right, now we're getting more into my more recent research. All right, so solitary ghost hunters began to form a national and sometimes international community with the advent of the internet. So we're talking into the 90s. 1990s, I guess I have to say now that some people were born after the 1990s. Popular ghost lore, the legacy of spiritualism, the popular understandings of parapsychology combined in the ghost hunting subculture. The subculture would rise out of the shadows of internet forums and into the mainstream American consciousness in October of 2004, when the Sci-Fi Channel began airing the reality television series Ghost Hunters. This show featured two Roto-Rooters plumbers from Rhode Island who, in their off time, traveled with their paranormal investigation team to investigate hauntings in their region. Basically, people who believed their homes were haunted would find the team on the internet and reach out for help. The investigator's job was to determine whether the home was actually haunted, what was causing the haunting, and to provide solutions for living with the haunting or getting rid of it. The team was called the Atlantic Paranormal Society, or TAPS, and this was part of this would spark a long tradition of tortured acronyms to make sort of like cheesy acronyms. Sorry. The show led to a ghost hunting boom in the US. Interest in the paranormal had run high in the US for decades, and paranormal television, whether fiction or documentary style, had been a mainstay of American movies and television for years. So, The X-Files in the 1970s, In Search Of, hosted by Leonard Nimoy. This had been an American interest for quite a while. It is hard to quantify the explosion of popular interest in paranormal investigation and ghost hunting that occurred after Ghost Hunters debuted. I am not a quantitative researcher, and there is not much specific polling about the world of ghost hunting. To give you an idea, though, show after show depicting the activities of real ghost hunting teams debuted after the success of Ghost Hunters. In October 2008, for example, the show Ghost Adventures premiered on Travel Channel. The show was loosely tied to travel, and that the ghost hunting team in the show would travel to various famously haunted locations around the country. And the show ended up being one of the network's biggest shows and is still on the air. So even the Travel Channel wanted a piece of ghost hunting. Sometime in 2016, there was a transition in 2015, but by 2017, the Discovery family of cable networks had converted their Travel Channel style network, Destination America. So basically, the Discovery Channel, the Discovery family of networks they mimicked the Travel Channel by starting a channel called Destination America, but then they soon realized that they could maybe make more money by making that into an all paranormal content channel anchored by ghost hunting reality shows. In 2018, Discovery acquired the actual Travel Channel, and rather than moving Ghost Adventures, which they saw as a big asset, they transformed Travel Channel into their paranormal channel with all the ghost hunting shows, and it still is until now. At the peak of the ghost hunting craze, which there's still lots of that going on. Tons of people are watching Ghost Adventures at this time of year, but I guess you might say the peak of the craze was maybe 2004 to 2014. But there's always like lulls and spikes, even with spiritualism. Throughout the 20th century, there were lulls and spikes. Like after World War II, there was a spike in seances. Anyway, so during the peak of the ghost hunting craze, there were very few cities or towns in the U.S. not being serviced by multiple ghost hunting groups. ParanormalSocieties.com, which was a directory site founded during that time, lists nearly 5,000 paranormal investigation teams in the U.S. And of course, many, many teams never listed on this random site. There have long been at least as many defunct teams as currently active teams. Many teams came together for a few years or only for a few investigations. They're constantly cropping up and dying down, leaving traces on the internet, and making it very difficult for ethnographers to contact active ghost hunting teams. Beyond the ghost hunters themselves, the ghost hunting subculture contains those who regularly consume ghost hunting media, which ranges from podcasts and online radio to books and streaming or cable television offerings. One ghost hunters book, Amy Bruni, who was one of the original ghost hunters and is now very popular on the show Kindred Spirits, released a sort of memoir / ghost book that was actually reviewed by the New York Times, I think, last year, which was kind of interesting. I think it was around Halloween, of course. There are hundreds of paranormal conventions around the US that focus on ghost hunting and often have feature presentations and opportunities to get photos with and autographs from the investigators featured on the reality shows. Recent studies have found that around half of Americans believe in ghosts or hauntings. So this is the general population. So around half to maybe slightly more than half of Americans in recent polling believe in ghosts or hauntings. And there's another chunk that's just unsure whether they exist or not. And ghost belief is common across demographic groups. And this is very interesting. In 2016, opinion data aggregating website YouGov found that the British population in general is slightly more likely to believe in ghosts than a creator. I guess we need some follow-up there, one poll, but perhaps though this is a future to which the US is headed. The ghost hunting boom was occurring during a time when demographers, sociologists, and religious studies scholars in the US were fascinated by the decline in religious affiliation and the rise of the nones, those with no traditional religious affiliation, and also the rise of the spiritual but not religious. Over the same period of time, the percentage of people in the US who believed in ghosts does not seem to have declined, and the ghost belief may in fact be growing. In fact, a strong majority of people in the US with no religious affiliation are not atheists or agnostics, and many hold beliefs incompatible with materialism. So even though many of you have probably heard this a lot before, even though religious affiliation is declining in the US, the percentage of atheists and agnostics is rising, but not nearly as quickly as those who decline affiliation. And a lot of these people who decline affiliation still have what we would consider supernatural beliefs or believe in God. I have even spoken to a couple ghost hunters who consider themselves atheists, yet believe in ghosts. Research shows that the relationship between frequency of religious service attendance and paranormal belief is curvilinear. The people who attend services the most frequently and the least frequently are the least likely to hold paranormal beliefs. Now, paranormal beliefs in the surveys with these findings include belief in ghosts, psychics, UFOs as alien spacecraft, cryptids such as Bigfoot and the Jersey Devil. So some scholars explain this statistical trend by arguing that Americans who never attend religious services are more likely to be atheists, materialists, or skeptics, and thus less inclined to supernatural beliefs in general or fringe science. On the other hand, Americans who attend religious services once or more a week are perhaps more open to supernatural beliefs and exploring unexplained phenomena, but they are committed to a metaphysical system that excludes deviant beliefs. Therefore, the sweet spot for paranormal belief is in the middle, which consists of people who attend religious services maybe once a month to once a year, people who are open to the supernatural or unexplained, yet not committed to a system that might police these kinds of beliefs. Factors such as these have led some researchers to propose that as religious affiliation declines, and yet those who leave do not rule out the supernatural or metaphysical, paranormal belief fills in the gap. More research is needed on this. In fact, the majority of ghost hunters I have interviewed are religious nuns, often having moved out of a Christian background, yet not given up the belief in God or a soul. All right, try to wrap this up here soon. So ghost hunters as empirical, right? They see themselves as empirical investigators. So ghost hunters frequently engage in their investigations, at least in part, to find empirical evidence of the soul and the afterlife. For them, the testimony of religious leaders and sacred texts is not enough anymore. One ghost hunter I interviewed, I call him Jacob, had been to many churches. There's a quote from him: "You name them, I've been to every church. I've been kicked out of every church. Roman Catholic, I've been to Methodist, I've been to Baptist, I've been to Lutheran, and my mouth gets me in trouble because I'm not really a follower." When he discusses some of the debates he has had over doctrine with particular church members, he reveals his empirical approach to the supernatural. Quote, "And of course, they would always bring it back to me. Well, how do you know about ghosts and everything? I've been out there with them, I've been hanging around them," end quote. He contrasts his empirical knowledge with their traditional knowledge, handed down but not experienced. Quote, "How do you know all this? You know all this because a bunch of men wrote this book way back in the day, which had been edited and edited and edited," end quote. Carl Johnson, a demonologist who appears in the very first episode of Ghost Hunters, explains, quote, "My major drive with ghost hunting is to substantiate evidence of an afterlife. I need some kind of, if not proof, then strong suggestion that there is continuance after this life. And that's my major motivation for ghost hunting," end quote. Ghost hunters also pride themselves on being skeptical, hard-nosed investigators, always considering natural causes for alleged hauntings and only accepting the best evidence. They will frequently discuss the ways in which they have debunk is a big key word, supposed paranormal activity in the past, which lends credence to their ghostly findings, right? So when they do find the supernatural or the paranormal, you'll believe them because they've debunked things in the past. A ghost hunter's guidebook from 2009 called the Everything Ghost Hunting Book states, quote, "A strong dose of healthy skepticism is a good place for any investigator of the paranormal to start. If you don't try to debunk potential paranormal experiences, you won't make a good investigator," end quote. Ghost hunters also generally claim to be scientific investigators in some sense. They realize they're not laboratory scientists, but they'll kind of, still kind of say they're scientific. So Zach Bagans, who's well known for being the star of the popular television series Ghost Adventures, comments on ghost hunting and science in the book he co-wrote. He says, quote, "Is paranormal investigation really a science? Yes, it is. I don't consider myself a scientist, but I would not be doing my job if I did not educate myself and stay on top of the latest theories surrounding our field of research. And what we do is just that, scientific research," end quote. Aside from their general approach to investigation, which they see as analytic, careful, and unbiased, ghost hunters often view their equipment as lending to their scientific credibility. Ghost hunters use a suite of technical equipment as modeled to them by the very first ghost hunting reality shows. Much of the popular equipment is used to measure energy fluctuations and other changes in the environment. Originally, much of this equipment was repurposed from its original use in mundane life, but over the last 20 years or so, companies have been producing equipment specifically designed for ghost hunting. One of the most popular devices originally, and still today, were various forms of handheld electromagnetic field meters. They measure fluctuations in electromagnetic fields, or EMFs, as they're often called, in the environment. Fluctuations in EMF are thought to be caused by spirits, which are theorized to be either made of energy or they use energy to manifest in the physical world. EMF meters were not originally designed for ghost hunting, but scores of specialized devices have been created by ghost hunters, and they are often debuted on the ghost hunting reality shows. Investigators also use night vision, full spectrum, infrared, and other types of cameras. The hope is to catch apparitions. Most often, what is captured are various video anomalies that are hard to decipher, and skeptics routinely dismiss them as technical glitches or otherwise natural, but investigators often defend them as paranormal. EVP, or electronic voice phenomena, are central to ghost hunting, probably the most central kind of evidence. EVP are mysterious voices or other sounds that appear on audio recordings, but were not heard at the time of recording by the naked ear. Various theories are offered as to how spirits cause these recordings. One theory is that spirits energetically imprint these audio anomalies directly to the recording device. EVP are often kind of whispery and indistinct. You can find tons of them online on YouTube. Ghost hunters assess their quality and classify them based on their clarity and strength as evidence. Often investigators perform audio editing to better decipher the EVP to kind of bring out the audio so you can better hear it. Ghost investigators also scientize some of their concepts and vocabulary. One example already mentioned is the idea that ghosts are comprised of energy or use energy. Ghost activity and psychic activity is often described in energetic terms. Sometimes it is not clear how exactly ghostly or psychic energy relates to electric or physical energy. Investigators will talk of emotional energy, residual energy left in the environment by episodes of violence or tragedy, that type of thing. So one common truism among ghost hunters is that they'll say something like, well, we know from physics that energy can neither be created nor destroyed. And of course, the human nervous system and body is full of electric charge and energy. So it stands to reason that when we die, that energy must continue in some way. And as they imply it in the form of, a ghost or something like that. All right, so that's the way in which ghost hunters see themselves as sort of scientifically, they have empirical evidence. But in another important sense, modern ghost hunting is empirical in a way that's important for its function as a 21st century spiritual practice. Increasingly, in the new religious landscape, spiritual seekers crave experience. This is aptly demonstrated by scholar of religion Courtney Bender, in her study of turn of the 21st century alternative spirituality in Cambridge, Massachusetts. These New England spiritual seekers, you can call them New Age or metaphysicals, focus on experience, cultivating experience, and interpreting experience. Bender explains that a focus on religious experience has been appealing to religious liberals and seekers since the Enlightenment, when intellectual currents moved religion from the realm of reason, rationality, and the mind to the realm of emotion and the heart. Religion was no longer a set of logical propositions to one assented to. It was a matter of emotional attachment and experience. Drawing on Wayne Proudfoot, Bender illustrates how locating religion in the realm of experience became an apologetic tactic of religious liberals that became prominent in the early 20th century and is still maintained by even some sociologists in the 21st century. Religious experience has been depicted as something irreducible and universal at the root of religion. According to this view, sociologists and other scholars like us, can analyze and reduce how these experiences are described, narrated, explained, or elaborated in ritual, but they cannot reduce the experience itself. Right? Once again, saving religion from materialism. Both ghost hunters and Bender's metaphysicals are heirs to these intellectual currents. A wide range of religious experiences are pursued among spiritually inclined nuns in the current, no religious affiliation nuns in the current religious landscape. So you have, I'm sure you can all name some forms of meditation and yoga, neo-pagan magic ritual, psychoactive drug use, and ghost hunting basically sits alongside all these practices on the menu of religious experience. Yeah, that about wraps it up. I don't want to talk too much longer. I guess we can go to questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniel. You've given us a lot of food for thought, and we have a number of questions queued up and ready to go. So I'll just kind of moderate them, if that's okay. One of the questions comes from Liv Wisniewski. She was asking about kind of the chronology that you were talking about earlier. And she asks, like, do you foresee kind of a new resurgence, a potential resurgence of spiritualism, ghost hunting, as we continue to move away after the COVID pandemic? Similar to what we saw after the trauma of events like World War II.
I guess just from my observations, I don't think I saw more of a resurgence in. I guess I'd have to maybe look at some of the polling data. The most recent data I've looked at is probably right before the pandemic. So I'm not really sure. Actually, Natasha Michaels, who's a scholar at Texas State, is writing a book about sort of like how COVID has changed, death practices. So that might be interesting to look at. But it seems like I don't know if we're just so saturated by this ghost interest that I don't know if a spike is not noticeable. I don't know if we even entered a phase in religious eclecticism when it's there's no mainstream to which to compare. So I guess I'm really not sure. It seems like we're pretty saturated in this ghost interest and formal spiritualism, where people are holding seances. I don't know how much that's occurring anymore, but of course, the psychics who exist today that you can visit on the roadside and the mediums that exist in places like Lilydale, New York, are all heavily influenced by spiritualism up the 19th century.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Lots of other questions here. This is an interesting question. It was a question about pheromones. Apparently, one theory is about kind of emotionally charged pheromones being left, after somebody's death or something like that. And so that kind of goes because you talked about kind of auditory empiricism or visual empiricism or something like that. Are there other senses that are involved or ways of measuring that these ghost hunters use that's kind of outside of kind of the visual and the auditory?
So the ghost hunter's body is just as much of an important tool to them as the devices, right? So often when I've been on ghost hunts, you think that this place, so I've been accused of being too skeptical to experience the ghosts, right? But you think there was all this activity going on, right? People are feeling these weird feelings, they're getting headaches, they're getting nauseous. Strange smells has been a ghost phenomena for, going back for a long time, right? You'll smell the old man's cigar smoke or the woman's perfume, right? So there are smells. There's also feelings, right? So one of the important signs of a demon being present is a feeling of dread or fear or sudden anger. Zach Bacon's in Ghost Adventures, when he's been around demons, he's suddenly freaked out and started yelling at people and breaking things, right? Because he's overcome with anger. So there's definitely very somatic sensing of ghosts, things that that the equipment doesn't pick up. And of course, some ghost hunters still do use spirit mediums and what are called sensitives, which are people who basically feel the emotions of the dead and feel negative energy and positive energy, right? They just like sense energies, but they're not quite mediums.
Okay, great. So lots of potential sensory experiences. And
Mhm.
I think you do need to talk, and I'm going to take moderator's privilege here. Like you said, when you have been on these ghost hunts, so can you talk a little bit about kind of the experience of actually being there with some of these ghost hunters?
Yeah, I like, I've never seen anything that blew my mind. I've gotten freaked out, but that's just because of the general, like I'm walking around an old place in the dark and we're thinking about ghosts. Like one time I was in this like jail in Council Bluffs, Iowa, and me and my buddy, I always brought someone with me. Me and my buddy, who was also a PhD student, he's like a philosophical theology guy, so definitely a completely different field. He like the people who brought us were sure, he said, every time something happens. So they sent us into the most active place, the offices. This was like a 19th century jail, so there were offices and people lived upstairs back in the day. So they sent us into this closet that seemed to have a bunch of files and other office junk, and they closed us in the dark and gave us a night vision camera, and they made us stand in there for 20 minutes just like looking around with only the camera and like asking questions in the dark. And I was kind of freaked out, but nothing happened. I don't know. Nothing happened to us. I'm not dismissing anyone else's experiences or anything like that. I'm very, I guess you'd say I'm a ghost agnostic, and some people very, very close to me in my life have had intense experiences that, I'm not going to just dismiss for them, but yeah, it's just, I guess the people are just as interesting as the environment. It's just so
Mhm.
fascinating, seeing how people react, their reasoning, when things happen. Um, the ways in which, like, so basically almost the whole operation is a sort of dowsing, right? It's hard. Apparitions and things are rare, like the big phenomena where like a voice says get out, or like a ghost, you can see a person appear, is very rare. So basically you use all these pieces of minute equipment and feelings to kind of like pick up traces of spirits, right?
Mhm.
Like create ambiguous anomalies that you can maybe interpret as spirits or not. It's
Yeah.
like a way to like heighten experience when experience is hard to come by.
Yeah. That kind of relates to another question by Professor Christensen, who asks if you're familiar with recent work that explores the limits of human perception, like in quantum physics or animal senses, for example. Like there's a book by Ed Yong, which was about kind of the way that the animals perceive the world. And so, have you noticed that the ghost hunters kind of use that within their kind of scientific arguments? To echo the concerns, the language used by parapsychologists or ghost hunters, if they're trying to kind of detect in the way that some animals can, something beyond what humans can experience.
Yeah. Well, of course, on the most popular level, there's just like going back to people who consider themselves sensitives, right? They're basically calling on some kind of like beyond sense that they can sense things like residual emotion and things like that. I guess that on the most popular sense. I don't really know how much your average ghost hunter is reading this kind of work, but the parapsychologists definitely are. But the parapsychologists are often in the lab. But it is interesting, like like at the Division of Perceptual Studies, like these parapsychologists will draw on anything, to like chip away at the edifice of materialism, right? Their books mention quantum physics and things like this, and so I haven't actually read much of that literature, because I guess I'm not as much into, yeah, because I haven't considered as much the question of like whether these are things that can actually be sensed. But yeah, I think it definitely filters down into the ghost hunting subculture, when it gets to the popular level. Like I don't think your average ghost hunter is like reading these books on perception, these high level books on perception.
Well, that kind of gets to another question that I had, and I think it's also kind of related here too, is the influence of pop culture.
Hmm.
We talked, for example, about a lot about like TV shows and books and things like that. There's a question here about like what role do video games play in there
Yeah.
as well? Because that's a lot of times how most people consume a lot of pop culture nowadays is through the experience of video games and things like that. They mentioned specifically Phasmophobia, which is not a game I'm familiar
Hmm.
with, but I'm sure you
Yeah.
know. because especially too, I was struck by what you were saying about the equipment that modern ghost hunters use, or ghost hunters use, in that they're versions of equipment that they saw in the original show.
Mhm.
Right. Like, and so in which way are these empirical studies just kind of replicating pop culture experiences and not
Mhm.
actually kind of scientific ones, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I don't want to comment on whether the practices are scientific. So my dissertation, I say they're scientized. I don't know. I just don't want to go on the record either way. But
This will be on the internet, so no problem about that. Yeah. So
right, no, that's fine. It's scientized, right? So I'll leave it to the research scientists to say whether they're being scientific. I think a lot of parapsychologists that I've talked to and research scientists would say they're not being scientific. But yeah. So there's lots of like folk science, I guess, right? Popular ideas about what science entails. And as far as Phantasmophobia, the video game, it's like really, really closely based on actual ghost hunting, right? The tools they use, the stuff they do. The difference is you're way more likely to see an apparition or get killed by a ghost in Phantasmophobia. But there's actually a really good book on this, and I'm kind of confused about when it's coming out. Oxford University Press. I think it's available on Oxford Academic Online now, and the publisher is shipping it today. But I think the official publication date is November 7th. But there's a book called The Exorcist Effect by Joe Laycock and Eric Harrelson. Joe Laycock, Joseph P. Laycock, I guess is his published name, is at Texas State University, a very prolific guy, probably best known for his Satanic Temple book. But he basically talks about what he calls the exorcist effect, by which popular culture influences religious practice, which in turn influences popular culture again. So, like the one of the films it focuses on is The Exorcist, um, which um, which was like a phenomenon in 1971 and 1973, 71 when it was a book, 73 when it was a movie. And this, I like basically left out an entire aspect of modern ghost hunting that differentiates it from spiritualism, which is its intense interest in demons. But The Exorcist would influence people like Ed and Lorraine Warren, who were basically some of the most influential people in the ghost hunting subculture. They fashioned themselves as demonologists in the 70s and investigated the Amityville horror. Now there's a whole series of movies, the Conjuring series about Ed and Lorraine Warren, which in turn influences will in turn influence ghost hunters. And there's basically like a whole process. There's a whole process there. I've only read parts of the book, but this is basically a really good book to look to for looking especially at like demon belief and paranormal investigating, The Exorcist Effect. Um, but yeah, so this is definitely being explored. It's hard to overstate how important the Exorcist movie is for like paranormal belief now. There was an explosion of interest in exorcism in the Catholic Church afterwards. The Exorcist came along at a time when I think it was I can't maybe 1968 or 1969 when Time published its giant cover saying God is dead or is God dead, and the response from people who saw The Exorcist was like, no, we don't think God's dead, and we think demons are real and it's terrifying us. And of course, many scholars since then have been like, well, The Exorcist is really about, you know, women, puberty and women's power, and this is what's so scary. And maybe a little bit, but like, I mean, people were just afraid of demons. Honestly, I think that's a big explanation for it. But yeah, that might have been a little meandering.
no. I think that gets to another question that just popped up as well. And so I'm kind of trying to jazz Odyssey the questions into our discussion here. Is by Patrick Sheridan, which asks about, like, so you talked about kind of what was it called? The curvilinear relationship
Mm-hmm.
between church attendance and beliefs in ghosts. But kind of from the other perspective, is there any sense, like from organized religion, looking at ghost beliefs or ghost hunting specifically, and these ideas, like how are they perceiving, like are they seeing it in their congregations? Are there any kind of statements about these types of things? And I think that goes to what you were saying about kind of the presence of demons, because within a Christian theology, right, like, I mean, there is the presence of demons, like those are a real thing in many traditions, and not just kind of Christian, but other traditions as well. So
Mm-hmm.
what are you seeing kind of from organized religion, kind of talking back to the explosion of these ideas?
Well, I guess what's interesting is like that curvilinear relationship isn't my personal experience. I guess like my dad is a Lutheran pastor, my wife is an Episcopal priest, and in like these mainline Christian worlds, I've encountered tons of people who believe in ghosts and that type of thing. And And even though like for example, the Episcopal Church is often like held up as like the height of like liberal religion in the United States. There are still I believe most dioceses still have an official exorcist, which is getting more and more use in recent years. So it's kind of interesting because I know a lot of religious people, and some of the ghost hunters I interviewed are like committed Baptists and still do this stuff. They realize that they're pushing the boundaries, but they have they're the ultimate Protestants, right? They read the Bible for themselves and decide that this is permissible. So I guess I also know plenty of evangelicals who have these kind of ghost beliefs, but I guess it's so. For example, my there's a guy in my dad's in-laws family. He's like a hardcore Pentecostal from the Shenandoah Valley, right? And I mentioned stuff I researched, and he was like, "Well, of course these people are mistaken. That's all the devil, right? So you still do get that as well, where ghosts and are not permitted. It's all Satan." Which is also the position that early Protestants took until Catholicism stopped being so scary and materialism became more scary. Then Anglicans can go back to referring to ghosts as real. But yeah, I hope that once again wasn't too meandering. But yeah, basically paranormal belief is entering into congregations and things like that. You'd probably be shocked how many people in the pews do believe in ghosts and stuff. I mean, 50% of the population, or maybe more, the Chapman University Survey of American Fears in like 2017 put it at like 56%. But yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So we have a lot more questions, several more questions here, and maybe time for one more before we're kind of out of time. And it comes from an anonymous person, and they're wondering about in your own research is that there's a lot of kind of academic metaphors of kind of ghosts, and I'm thinking of like Derrida's hauntology. There's also like Avery Gordon's ghostly matters, like within sociology and things like that. Like, do those engage your work? I mean, do you see those as kind of a separate thing, or are they just kind of simply academic metaphors that people can use, but they're not necessarily kind of connected to what you're interested in?
I think it's a strong temptation for people who research what I do to reference things like, hauntology to be taken seriously, I guess. I'm an independent scholar, so and I'm not really on the job market, so I guess I have to worry less about that. But like I guess that has kind of frustrated me at times because it's like people have a hard time just accepting how much things like ghost belief affect real people's lives and affect how they act and affect their worlds. It doesn't always have to be metaphor. I'm not saying those metaphors don't work. I think hauntology has lots of interesting insights, but I guess for me, I just like the actual ghosts are pretty interesting. Uh, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying I completely dismiss it because there's things like ghost belief is haunted by things like race, by America's sins. There's like all of that kind of stuff that I didn't really get into. Like the ghosts of enslaved people are really popular, haunting material in the South. Mental asylums, old prisons are considered some of the most haunted locations in the United States, right? There's definitely stuff to be done there. But I guess there's like, there's tons of people doing that. And I guess I just focus more on, like I was saying about The Exorcist, The Exorcist can be a metaphor for many things, but there's also the extent to which people are just really afraid of demons.
So on that note, Daniel saying, Dr. Wise saying that Derrida is wrong. I think that's a just kidding, of course. Thank you. This has been a really wonderful conversation. We are unfortunately out of time. There are some more questions there. But I'm sure there'll be more forthcoming from Dr. Wise sometime in the future. Thank you everybody for spending your afternoon or evening or wherever you are with us. Again, we have another presentation that'll be coming up in November. So be on the lookout for that. Until then, thank you again. Thank you, Dr. Wise, for a really wonderful presentation, a really stimulating one. Lots of great questions, lots of great conversation afterwards. And until then, everybody take care and enjoy your Halloween, I guess.